Who was Napoleon's greatest marshal? The emperor elevated 26 individuals to this, the highest honour in the French army. What unified these men has long been debated. Some were driven by honourable intentions and a sense of duty. Others were nepotistic, lackadaisical, and lickspittle sycophants. Bravery was common, competency frequent, charm and joie de vivre optional. Quite what the magic ingredient was that made a marshal of the First French Empire one of the greatest has long eluded scholars. But what is beyond doubt is the enduring fascination that these characters and their exploits hold over fans of the period. Their names ring through the history of the period in a symphony of war. Ney, Murat, Soult, Massena, Poniatowski, Marmont, Bernadotte, Suchet, names that are instantly recognisable and immediately conjure visions of opulence, heroism, and perhaps even glory. These men are still regarded as so significant in French history that references to them and their exploits are etched in the landscape of the nation's capital. From boulevards to stations, from monuments to statues, and an entire hillside in Paris's most famous cemetery all bear testament to the high esteem in which Napoleon's marshals are held. But who was the greatest? We've heard the pitches, we've weighed the arguments, we've counted your votes and verified the results. 26 individuals have been whittled down to just 2. Tonight, the Iron Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout squares up to one of history's most exalted chiefs of staff, Louis-Alexandre Berthier, in the final chapter of one of history's most hotly contested debates. Who wins? You decide. The final of the Battle of the Marshals starts right now, here on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod. The long-enduring question of who was Napoleon's greatest marshal comes to its climax tonight as we finish our Battle of the Marshals series. You've weighed and judged the various pitches, we've had standoffs, we've had backstabbing, and we've had balloon debates that have seen people callously thrown into the detritus and out of the basket. Only 2 survived, Berthier and Davout. Now, organising the assault on behalf of Berthier, we have Emeritus Professor of the United States Command and General Staff College and author of All for the King's Shilling, The British Soldier Under Wellington, Professor Ed Koss. Ed, good to see you, mate. How are you doing?
Great. It's great to be here. Great to be with Rachel. Great to be with you, Zach.
And as you've just heard, fighting her own Aristocrat on behalf of Davout, the maestro of the Marshal Mayhem series, which will be making a welcome return to the Napoleonic Wars pod in 2026. Rachel Stark. Rachel, welcome back. It's been an age. How are things with you?
Very good, thank you. Yes. Glad to be back amongst the Marshals again.
So we're going to dive in at the deep end. You're going to get 90 seconds to make the case for your contender. No more. Otherwise, those inimitable words from Joaquin Phoenix will be ringing in your ears.
You think you're so great because you have boats!
Ed, we're going to start with you.
I only ask for a few seconds before we begin my pitch, only because we've never established up front the criteria for greatest. We've never said, is it for most spectacular battlefield success, for longevity, for those who created his string of successes, which I think comes out to be 41-6 overall. Just thought I'd let the audience think about that because there's a difference between tactical success and legacy. And I will begin mine. I will never throw any shade on somebody as incomparable as Louis-Nicolas Davout. I am a great fan, and I will always honor him. I will only say this, though, that when it comes to legacy, sadly, my friend is not studied at all at the senior learning institutions for American officers in America. His name, his battles have been forgotten. But I am honored to say that the Army Command and General Staff College does in fact recognize me for acting as a 19th century computer, putting the systems and command and control at Napoleon's disposal. I am credited for the creation of the modern decentralized command construct. And I was charged with successfully building administrative teams that essentially led to the formation of the senior staff. So Napoleon's work and what we did together, we live on. And if that's a radical decentralization, this product, then even though I did not lead on the battlefield, one might say this method of waging war, this transmission, this creation of this system, maybe this was something that bears remembering.
You think you're so great because you have boats!
Professor Ed Cost there offering us a seance with Berthier in a speech delivered in the first person.
Always first person.
If you listen back to the series, he's done the whole thing consistently in the first person. It's quite remarkable. I'm not going to start picking holes yet. I'm going to save that for later. Rachel, straight over to you. Your 90 seconds.
Okay, well, a bit similar to Ed, I'd a bit of a preface to add, similar to Berthier. I had also thought, well, how are we defining greatness? And very much that great and indispensable are not synonymous. If we were arguing who's the most indispensable marshal, I would concede straight away and we could all go and have a lovely cup of tea. But we're arguing who the greatest is. And I would argue if we benchmark the marshals on 3 criteria, not just the 2 we're debating tonight, but everybody, Davout's going to edge it. And here's why I think that is the case. First, if we look at administrative and organisational capability, obviously Berthier is going to win that by a country mile. He is without peer, the finest chief of staff of the age, possibly of any age. However, administratively speaking, Davout is no slouch. He doesn't just command troops, he builds a corps that stays coherent under pressure, sustainably throughout the Napoleonic Wars. His corps' discipline, their staff work, their readiness for battle, their supply was not accidental. That was Davout's policy, and he, uses that excellent administrative ability and translates that into combat power. But if we step away just from administration and we look at battlefield command, I would argue Davout has possibly one of the cleanest stress tests of any of the marshals, obviously at Erstadt. The numbers alone are phenomenal. It could have been a disaster, but he controls the battle, he stabilises the line, he flips what should have been a defeat into a victory. And Napoleon's presence isn't there. This is not a Napoleonic victory, this is a Louis-Nicolas Davout victory. But thirdly, and I think really crucially, there's a lot of great battlefield commanders among the marshals. There are not a lot of excellent independent commanders amongst the marshalate. And Davout's greatness is transferable. It's portable. He succeeds not just under Napoleon, as all the marshals do, but also when he's alone. In Hamburg, he runs a prolonged siege and governance.
You think you're so great because you have boats!
The darker side of which I'm sure we're going to get to in this episode, but he only yields when he has verifiable assurance from a source he trusts that Napoleon has abdicated. And there's a lot of brilliant battlefield men, but when they come to independent command, that's when we see them start to slip. Now, Davout doesn't. He stays consistently excellent. So Berthier is extraordinary. There is no denying it. He is an exceptional administrator. He is absolutely integral to Napoleon, but I think that sort of indispensability almost works against him because his greatness is a conduit for Napoleon's genius. And it's that sort of symbiotic partnership that I think is so enmeshed in Napoleon that it doesn't allow him to stand just on his own, comparably speaking, in the way that Davout does. Berthier is the man who's the architect of the system. Davout's the man the system sends when they want a victory. And that's why I think if we look at these 3 criteria, for me, Davout is going to come out on top as greatest marshal.
I think somewhere along the way, Joaquin Phoenix interrupted Rachel there. What we might do is allow the rest of that to be played out just so that folks can hear it, because it was very eloquent and well put. But I think there is something very interesting in all of this. you both rightly say what constitutes greatness. That's always been at the core of this series. That's why there is this debate to be had. If we'd sat down and defined the parameters at the start, then it wouldn't be a discussion. It would just be a case of something very empirical and measurable. But I think what constitutes that greatness is really key. And it's been interesting to look at kind of questions of morality and whether or not that should be a factor within what constitutes greatness, questions of betrayal vis-a-vis Bernadotte, which are nonsensical because it wasn't a betrayal, but that's a rant for another day. There's a lot to get our teeth into here. I want to force you to play devil's advocate here, though. If you were obliged to pick out, and you are obliged to pick out, what is the chink in your chosen individual's armor, what's the flaw in the argument for your individual? Rachel, we're going to start with you.
Well, I mentioned Hamburg, and I think that's always going to be the blot on Davout's legacy. Although it's interesting that, well, actually for both the guys we're talking about tonight, they don't have scandals in the sense that a lot of the marshals do. There's no self-enrichment, there's no looting, and so on. Davout's greatest flaw is his severity in this case, and part of that is what makes him such an excellent corps commander. It's what makes him such a good administrator. But in the sense of the siege at Hamburg, famously, the civilians who could not vouch that they had enough food to see them through the siege were turned out into winter conditions. Now, Davout justified that by saying, well, militarily, he was left with two options: A, that they would starve, or B, that he would have to feed them from the army stores, and obviously the siege would be lessened. So militarily speaking, that's the right thing to do. But from a humanitarian point of view, obviously, as a terrible thing to do. And it's probably the greatest stain on Davout's character. So his severity, I mean, professionally speaking, you can argue the case, but I definitely think it's probably the darkest stain on his character for sure.
Ed, or should I say Berthier? What's the chink in your armor?
Probably two. I think we have two. One is he was not assigned, obviously, frontline combat charges that would have brought his name forward, would have provided him with the bona fides of being the greatest combat leader. So that's obvious. And the second was related to that is people don't understand warfare well enough to differentiate the logistics, recon, intel, quartering, all those kinds of things, the timing of messages, even today with computerized and satellite communications, just getting a unit from place to place in something even reasonable in time is almost impossible to do. So imagine doing it with runners. So that kind of warfare, that aspect of warfare is not often considered significant. So his lack of glory moments and sitting in a coach trying to decipher what Napoleon's saying and then getting the notes out to these commanders in far-flung places and figuring out they need 400,000 of these rations and they have to be, it's not very aesthetically, I think, pleasing to many who want to study history.
It has been quite interesting that if you wanted an inverted commas sexy marshal, you're going to go for somebody like a Ney, who very nearly got through on a number of occasions. You might want a Murat, depending on quite how you like your marshal. Now, neither of those have made the final cut. And as Rachel kind of made the point, neither of these individuals has major scandal attributed to them. So do you think that in some respects, what helps the case for these guys is that they just get on with the job? There is a sort of business-like element to how they go about what they do. And is the whittling down of these two as the top two an indication that, sure, people like the flash, they like the glamour and the swagger of a Murat or indeed a Ney, but whilst their hearts might be ruled by the flashiness, actually, objectively, what this outcome indicates is that what people value is, in fact, competency and credibility at the heart of serving the empire.
I would like to also throw in a word loyalty, because the end state is always mission success. And had either one of these individuals deviated, or as Rachel eloquently described, they weren't in it for monetary or personal aggrandizement. They didn't play that card. They didn't run that. They did what they were supposed to do. Almost always they were reliable. They were loyal. I think that's what got us both here.
And I think there's something infinitely satisfactory in the fact that when we're dealing with a cast of characters like the Marshals, sort of synonymous with ego and excess, and I'm not trying to imply that neither Berthier nor Davout had egos, obviously that's insane. But when you think about these big personalities that we're dealing with, the fact that we've got down to two of the most unglamorous, unsexy, but hyper competent, hyper professional, there's something reassuring about that. I think in looking at the world where, in every nation, in every end of the political spectrum, we've got loudmouths and rant-a-gobs popping up and sort of taking over the airwaves everywhere. Is there something not quite satisfactory that we're down to two guys who weren't about performance, who weren't about, making grandiose speeches and charging headlong necessarily, but who got the job done, even if they weren't particularly amiable people?
Yeah, and this was always a sort of the agenda, I guess, behind this series, was to see how do people actually get to grips with remembering the period and who wins and who falls. And it wasn't just about sort of bashing a few myths on the head and having a bit of fun, which obviously has been part of the point of this. It was also about kind of using this to try and get a sense of how do people actually think about these guys and how do people rate success? Is it just hyperbole? Is it just, Ney with his flashiness and the gestures, or is there actually a respect for the outcome and as you said, Rachel, kind of getting the job done? And this is an impossible question to answer definitively, but what are your senses of how these two would have felt about the fact that they were in the running as the final two? We talked about egos, and there are a lot of egos amongst the Marshalette. Egos are not in short supply in the French imperial court. How would they have felt, and would they have regarded this as a contest? Because the argument is often made that this is chalk and cheese that we're comparing here. Berthier, administrative role. Some people turn around and describe him as a glorified clerk. I'm going to get Ed to respond to that in due course. Emphatic shakes of the head from both Rachel and Ed there. But equally, Davout, could he have done what Berthier had to do? So there are all kinds of queries here. Would they have regarded it as a fair fight? Would there have been sort of a begrudging nod to the other? Like, yeah, okay, it's the two of us. We kind of suspected as much, we just get on with our job. What's your read of how they would have reacted to this?
Well, they're probably burling in their graves, being up against each other. They were hardly the best of friends.
I'm not sure that they. I'm not sure that they would have particularly enjoyed, but the idea that I think they would have both believed they belonged, absolutely. But I'm not sure they had to be interchangeable. We have to maybe get rid of that idea that to be indispensable, to be the greatest, you have to exchange one for the other in their skill sets. We just have to decide which skill set was most indispensable. I came across, that's why I took Berthier, because when this individual named Ed Koss was teaching, he discovered that Berthier was a bigger deal than he thought. He found that I was a bigger deal in the Command and General Staff College because they look at the way the U.S. Army works, which is they know everything's going to go to heck, as soon as they make contact with the enemy. But they have all these systems in place from logistics on down, so those commanders can make abrupt decision making, and they always mention that those systems, the whole milieu, the whole thing goes back to this guy named Berthier, who started the first decentralized system. And I went, well, that's pretty interesting. So the soldiers don't get to study, maybe unfortunately in their time frame, what the Marshals did. They get Napoleon, they get some of Berthier, and then they get lots of Clausewitz.
Okay, so we've considered what they would have made of being in this context. But equally, what would Napoleon have made of this? Do we have indicators from Napoleon's... I mean, Napoleon was not one for keeping his opinions to himself, and he certainly wasn't one for casting shade, often unjustifiably, when he felt that there was reason to do so. So what would Napoleon have said in support of this? You can very easily reach for the fact that Berthier is number one on the list, but does that really mean anything? I've never had the sense that it's a ranking system, that numbering on the list. So what do we have by way of endorsement, I guess, for both of our candidates from the Emperor himself?
I've got two quick ones. Napoleon said of me in my campaigns, Berthier was always to be found in my carriage. During the journey, I used to study the plans of the situation and the reports sent in, sketch out my plans for battle from them, and arrange the necessary moves. Berthier would watch me at work, and at the first stopping place of rest, whether it was day or night, he made the orders and arrangements with a method and an exactness that was truly admirable. For this work, he was always ready and untiring. That was Berthier's special merit. It was very great and valuable, and no one could have replaced him. And the second one, when he was talking about Waterloo, he said, if Berthier had been there, I would not have met this misfortune. And for Napoleon, who was not exactly one to throw praise around either, I find that pretty remarkable. Not to disparage, of course, like my admirable friend here.
Yeah, and I think very similarly, we've got some quotes that kind of evidence his admiration or trust in Davout. There's praise, obviously, of his battlefield conduct, obviously. The fact when he hears the numbers at Erstein, he goes, oh, well, your marshal must be seeing double. Nobody could win a victory on that kind of scale. But then he tells other people Marshal Davout's had a glorious encounter. But the fact that, crucially, on numerous occasions, it is Davout that he entrusts to hold the right wing of the army, I think that is evidenced in that I know Davout will be where I need him to be, exactly when I need him to be, and do what I need him to do. In terms of, very similar as we've already said, with Berthier, in terms of their moral code, he said of Davout, well, I have to give to Davout because he won't take for himself, i.e. he's not pinching everything that isn't nailed down like some of the others. And when we see the Waterloo campaign, and yes, Berthier is crucially missing, but he gives Davout Paris, and he says, I can entrust Paris to no one but you, because he knows that loyalty is unshakable. And the fact there even is an army to fight Waterloo in the first place is down to Davout. Then we've got all the other bits. Well, what if actually he had his demonstrably best battlefield commander there? Had he had Berthier and Davout, would Waterloo have been a completely different story? Possibly. But the fact that everything he does and says and entrusts to Davout clearly indicates, I know I can trust you, I know you were loyal, but crucially, I know you'll get it done.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? We don't often dwell on counterfactuals on the show, but I would put some serious money on the idea that if you have Davout and Berthier with Napoleon on the Waterloo campaign, the entire campaign is just a world away from what it actually is. We often comment on the show about how the Achilles heel for Napoleon is certainly a lack of Berthier. And if you had Davout commanding the left wing instead of Ney, that battle very likely at Quatre Bras looks very, very different. I guess there's a question to dwell on here in terms of the loyalty. We talk about Davout being one of those who returns in 1815 to Napoleon's side when the emperor comes back. Berthier famously not so much. Now, there's obviously that huge debate about his death, whether it's a fall, whether he's defenestrated, quite what the rationale is there in terms of the reasons why he doesn't go back. But he hasn't dropped everything and run to Paris. So, Ed, what can we discern about Berthier's loyalty in the longer term?
His loyalty is solid. His fatigue from war is a monumental factor. I think, again, people who read about war on paper do not understand the PTSD, the complete mental fatigue from dealing with this, because he does this from 1800 on. So you're talking a decade and a half of continual warfare. He's the one that stays up. And I'll slip back. I marvel at my own capacity, the incomprehensible number of organizational decisions that are made over and over, time and time again. No human being can stand up. I think he just needed time. And just so you know, I was helped out of that window. Okay, I did not commit suicide, because if you see the building, I would have gone up at least 2 more stories. Because this one, and then to land on my head, I needed help to go out that way. So it was actually by a Frenchman and his Prussian cousin, if you really want to know. They came up and tried to ensure that I would not join Napoleon. So that made that decision for me. And it's something that, it is a counterfactual, isn't it? What happens if we had both joined him? I saw us both nodding when you were describing that. And I was thinking of, as much as I may not have personally gotten along with Davout, I respect him enormously. And had he been on the left, Quatre Bras would have been entirely different, and this thing would have played out. And so I think my loyalty was steadfast, my fatigue, and being helped to my death. Because if I jump, I'm most likely going to land, and I'm not going to die landing on my legs. But when you're thrown out a window, you're going to land on your head, which is what happened.
Something I want to dwell on, which we've touched on ever so slightly in terms of their thoughts on each other, is their relationships with other marshals. And wrapped around this is a really important question of, does it matter? Or rather, to what extent does it matter? Because you can argue this both ways. You know, everybody's got an ego. They're all competing with each other. Obviously, they're going to have fallings out. The flip side of this is they need to work together because they are all subordinate to Napoleon. Now, Berthier's role inherently means that he can't really afford to have big fallings out, because if he goes and snubs Suchet or Marmont, and Marmont, you know, is uncooperative once receiving orders from Berthier, that creates huge challenges. Equally, Davout, as a corps commander, as so many of the marshals were, is reliant on support from other corps commanders, i.e. other marshals. The whole way in which Napoleon wages war is built upon mutual cooperation between these corps commanders. So to what extent does this matter? and how well do your individuals score against that test? Ed?
I think that the respect is there because at any given time, if I did not respect Davout, I could have shut off supplies. And therefore, as the most independently trusted commander, I could have made sure that he couldn't have gone off and seen and done what he did on the battlefield. And I would never have done that to him. And I would never have done that because it deconstructs Napoleon's system. And I think the fact that Davout was always given the trust and support he needed shows that you don't have to like someone to make the system work, because it's not about you, it's about the mission.
Yeah, I would say similar for Davout in the sense that he was a professional. He's not anything like the most sociable of the marshals. He is not entirely very popular amongst the other marshals. Famously, he's awkward, he's cold, he's socially inept. He's not the marshal you would invite out for dinner, but that's a flaw in a dinner guest. It's not a flaw in a military commander. He has very good relationships with some marshals. He's famously very, very good friends with Oudinot. He gets on very well with Sincere. He's got a sort of professional, mutual professional respect with Ney, even though they're not what MD would describe as good friends. But even with the marshals he didn't like, Davout's priority was Napoleon. He was fanatically loyal to Napoleon. So even when working with marshals, he'd put his foot down. I mean, he famously says to Murat in Russia, look, you can throw away the lives of your own men as you choose. You bloody well won't throw away mine. But when he needs to work with him, he thinks Murat's a pillock. He doesn't necessarily, get on with everybody else. He hates Bernadotte, of course. But he puts that aside. He doesn't flounce off in a tantrum when he feels like he doesn't get the credit that he deserves, like some marshals. He doesn't throw a hissy fit when he's got to serve under somebody that he doesn't think he should be serving under, like some marshals. Even when he's peeved, even when he thinks, why am I serving under this complete banana? He gets on with it and does his job. So I think the professionalism, again, is what distinguishes him from some of the others.
So where do we go from here? I guess the important thing to dwell on is greatest moments. What are the best moments for your respective candidates? How do they stack up against each other? And how important are they in the grander scheme of things in terms of the timelines? If this is the moment where your individual shines, how much actually rides upon success in that moment? And if it goes the other way, what actually happens? I appreciate that those are counterfactuals, but it is a measure fundamentally of greatness, that if your greatest moment is a moment that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, that's potentially Achilles' heel. So Rachel, we're going to start with you.
I mean, it's obvious what I'm going to talk about, isn't it? It's Erstadt, which is one of Davout's finest moments. Not by any means his only one, as I've said. Like, he's crucial roles in Austerlitz and Wagram and Eckmühl and numerous other instances. But the numbers, as I keep repeating myself, alone stack up against any battle. But it's not just the numbers, it's the fact that against the odds they face, against repeated attacks, vastly outnumbered, it would have been very easy for Davout, had he been, uber cautious or unwilling to act without Napoleon's, complete control, to have turned tail and gone away, to have gone, oh no, we're going to retreat, we're going to wait until I've got the emperor's absolute instructions. But he doesn't. He uses his own initiative and he holds the line. Now, he's not a charismatic guy. We've covered that. He is not a Ney or a Lan or a Murat, the kind of guy that's going to get your blood pumping and let's charge the enemy. But he does inspire and kind of motivate his men. He holds the line. He's amongst his men. He's holding up morale. And that's an astonishing victory, as evidenced by, I think, two things. A, that Napoleon verbally says, he's had a tremendous affair and good grief, he must have been saying double. But I think, crucially, that it's later referred to as Jena Auerstadt. it's so good that I kind of think there's a little bit of him that goes, yeah, well, we're going to tie that to my victory. That's not just totally independent. We're not going to give the guy too much credit here. He's not my equal. What happens if it's not a success? Realistically, what happens to 1806? What happens when the army that is viewed as being undefeatable, that is the masters of Europe, that are the force to be reckoned with, suddenly suffers a setback? Not just in terms of the numbers. What happens if you lose Davout? What happens if you lose, Goudon or Friant or somebody like that? But what happens if the Grand Army gets this psychological check of, oh, wait a minute, hold on, maybe we can lose? And you kind of see that later on when Archduke Charles is the first to kind of deal them this kind of setback. What happens to the 1806 campaign if Davout's not pinning down the forces there while Napoleon's fighting the rest at Jena? There's a potential chain reaction that goes on. Again, totally counterfactual. We can't say for sure, oh, well, then that would have happened. But would the 1806 campaign have been such a resounding success if we pulled the little linchpin of Auerstadt out of there? And I don't think it would have been.
Okay, we'll come back to that in a second, because there is a counter argument. My job is to be needly and weaselly and go, oh well, what about? Because there is a counter argument to sort of say, well, it's one corps, and how much does that really change? But I want to let Ed comment, and I'll be equally weaselly vis-a-vis Ed's top pick for best moment, which I'm going to hazard a wild guess, Ed, and say that it might just happen to be a little thing called Austerlitz.
First off, I want to note that how little shade Rachel and I have been throwing at each other, which surprises you to no end, but that's because of the respect, and I think that's why both these marshals are here. This is difficult for me because I was always at the center of it all, but never at the front of it all. Other marshals made a huge difference in the outcome of individual battles, and I respect them all, and I certainly respect Davout for the outcomes and the sacrifices and their individual deeds. But I have to say that no marshal other than me influenced almost nearly every aspect of Napoleon's overall operations. But one of my first ones, the ones that emotionally stayed with me, was the whole, after the coup of 18 Brumaire, was the crossing of the Alps. The whole campaign, the bold, prodigious, unprecedented campaign to cross the Alps, was planned by Napoleon, but I had organized 9 divisions. We only had 40,000 men, but I had to come up with 400, 500,000 rations every 10 days, move along trails, we were moving ordnance by tree trunks, come up with shoes. We were moving things on barges, and then we got them over a mountain. I mean, it was an unbelievable challenge. And thanks to the planning and the operational oversight, and of course, Lannes and Napoleon's control, we opened up Italy to the French. And the victory at Marengo, as close as that was, followed. And with it, Napoleon fought and won, and then opens up Italy for the French. That was the beginning. That was the opening. And maybe that's why it sticks with me. Yes, Austerlitz was there in the movement, and absolutely. I have many of those, but the first one, the opening, because it had such a long-term effect on the entire Napoleonic era. Had that gone, had we logistically and operationally failed to move the troops the way he envisioned, we might not have had much of a Napoleonic era. So I surprised you a little bit on that one.
You did. Boy, did you surprise me, because I was convinced it's the obvious go-to, right? It's a very shrewd tactic to basically sort of claim Napoleon's success at Austerlitz as fundamentally being down to Berthier, which I suppose is sort of underpinning a lot of your argument that, a lot of these big moments that Napoleon wins, he wins because Berthier is a facilitator of them, just as Napoleon is the instigator, and let's be real, the marshals are the ones who then go and translate
They do.
all of that into facts on the ground. So there is a problem here, which is that we're witnessing a symbiotic relationship. Everything comes through Napoleon, down through Berthier, and then down to people like Davout.
And I don't mean to downplay the Austerlitz. I don't.
No.
You asked me, and it was the one that started it all. So that's always going to stay with you perhaps the longest.
Rachel, let me come back to you. I promised to be sort of weaselly and pick holes in. I mean, it's a low point as a commentator on the Napoleonic period that I'm picking holes in Auerstadt. But let me nonetheless embrace the weasel.
I meant to say Austerlitz, by the way. I said Austerlitz. I meant to say Austerlitz. Sorry.
No worries.
Stumbled.
Let me embrace that weasel part of the brain, and just sort of say, if the Prussians win at Auerstadt, it's not that impressive a victory. What makes this so impressive, right, is one corps holds off.
Vice versa, yeah.
Exactly. If it ends up playing out the other way, the way that mathematics, the way that probability, the way that any external observer would look at this and go, yeah, that it's going to be a Prussian victory because of sheer numbers. Does it really change that much, in the sense that from Napoleon's perspective, you spin it in propaganda terms? You know, Davout valiantly held off the entirety of the Prussian army with a single corps. They were so rubbish that they struggled to break him. In the end, he had to pull back. You can very easily spin that. The rest of the army is still intact. I'm not disputing the psychology of it, but again, Napoleon, the master of propaganda during this age, can very quickly turn that around. Does that therefore mean that, unquestionably impressive though the feat itself is, actually if things had gone the other way, it wouldn't have echoed in quite the same way as, in Ed's case, Marengo and crossing the Alps?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valid point. And I think it depends if you are framing the situation as just, oh, Davout had to hold them off and withdrew. Frame it a slightly different way. If, let's be real, if Davout's killed on the battlefield, if, you know, a lot of the senior command of his corps is gone, that to me, I think we could conceivably argue, I think any of the marshals form a linchpin at some point. If there's no Murat and 13 Vendômière, does Napoleon get massacred? If there's no Marmont actually feeding into the crossing of the Alps, it's his innovation that gets the artillery over it. Equally, if Massena's not pinning down the enemy at Genoa, does Marengo happen the way it's going to be? We could kind of, they're all linchpins at some point. But if we take Davout out of the equation completely, I think I made the point on some of the other episodes that it's funny how many other people's finest hours he turns up in. Maybe not as the central player, but he's very crucial. He turns up to hold the wing of the army when he's needed. You know, he is there at Eylau, he is there at Wagram, he gets the victory at Eckmühl, and crucially, even in all the horror of Russia, it is when Davout's men finally break that's the right, guys, we've had it. So is the impact on his corps, if he's just defeated, potentially the same? I would argue no. If you lose Davout, I would argue possibly yes, because you lose the marshal who, like I say at the start, is the guy who can do everything. He doesn't just spike in one area. I mean, the thing I always say about Berthier reminds me of the quote they apply to Mycroft Holmes. All other men are specialists. His specialty is omniscience. And I think that sums Berthier up like perfectly. And a lot of the other marshals are specialists in one category. And I feel like Davout's the guy who can kind of bridge them all. And if you lose that one commander who can be trusted with everything, who can be trusted to govern without looting and pillaging, who can be trusted to show strategic innovation when it's needed, who can be trusted to command alone when everything's going to hell around him, I do think there's going to be an effect.
Let me continue to ask needly questions and build upon that point, and put Ed under the spotlight for a moment here. Davout has his quite a vast skill set in terms of yes, command and control, yes, ability on the battlefield. He also is known as being a little bit Wellington-esque in some of his approaches. He is concerned about the welfare of his men. That inherently requires a logistical element, which raises the question that if you had to, could you parachute Davout into Berthier's role and get by in a way that if you parachuted Berthier into Davout's role, actually there would be a noticeable degradation in terms of the effectiveness of that corps. In other words, Berthier doesn't have much in the way of experience of independent command, and when he does, it's not as glittering as some of the others, shall we say. So basically, can Davout do Berthier's job, but Berthier therefore becomes a one-trick pony?
Well, since you're being prickly, I want to be prickly back. I don't think that's a germane question. Okay, I don't think it, because they're not the same individual. They don't have the same skill set. So playing counterfactual with that doesn't give us any insight into the two individuals. It doesn't give us any insight into the greatest. It just plays with a pierce. No, I don't think it does, because we're looking at who did their jobs in the real world. And so that never happened. And so I don't see how trying to answer that gets us anywhere. And I'm not saying that's just because I'm not sure that Davout couldn't have done my job. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that because I'm unlikely that I could have done what Davout did in the field. But it's not as easy as it sounds. Davout then, knowing Napoleon's mind, knowing the verbiage, reading his handwriting, knowing the idea, like when I said I had 9 divisions to get them over the mountains, I'm sending out individual messages like a madman based on Napoleon's mutterings, and I'm trying to get them timed to come to specific places. That's warfare. That's the movement of troops to specific places at specific times. It's not just, being on the battlefield. So I'm not sure anybody could have been as attuned to Napoleon, because I'd been doing that for a decade and plus. And Napoleon is let's just say, he's an idiosyncratic individual. So it's not as easy as just dropping somebody else in there and go, yeah, I can be a pencil pusher. So I think it's a more complex question than it appears.
I agree with that completely. But I wouldn't denigrate. I know some people do sort of make the glorified Clark comment. I don't agree with that personally. But I do think there's a question here about adaptability and whether or not adaptability is one of a number of markers for greatness, and the ability to have an individual who can perhaps have done a better job than Soult is a really enduring question in terms of the impact of having Soult rather than Berthier. Now, I don't dispute what you're saying for a second. Nobody could have done Berthier's job as well as Berthier did. He builds a system around himself that slots perfectly into exactly what Napoleon needs. That is unquestionable. They are a double act. You can, whether you want to call Berthier Napoleon's sort of military wife, whether you want to call him his right-hand man, call him what you'd like. Yes, if you put Davout into Berthier's role and expected him to do as well as Berthier, you've got some seriously unrealistic expectations. But nonetheless, I would make the case that Davout still has to do an element of the kinds of stuff that Berthier has to do. Yes, Berthier directs the corps to arrive at certain moments in time, but a corps comprises of divisions and regiments and battalions. And
We're
so in
talking
terms of
different scale, though. We're
no
talking
doubt,
huge
but in terms of
difference in scale.
no question there. But in terms of the trickle down, there are still elements of Berthier's job that Davout has to recognize, has to think about, has to implement. He has to continue that trickle down element, which means he needs to know his men, the state that they're in, how far they've marched, do they have the rations. He has to manage some of that himself. So I think there is a question here about adaptability. And if you flip the two around, I'm just not convinced that, and I think this is one of the key chinks in Berthier's armour, which is why we need to dwell on it. I'm just not convinced that Berthier can do Davout's job quite as well as Davout could do if he was put into Berthier's shoes.
Don't know. We don't have enough data points of Berthier being out in the field. I mean, I don't know. You take the administrator of all time and you denigrate him because he doesn't lead charges. I don't quite see that making him less great, because that's a counterfactual, and I'm just not seeing it. That's all you're going to get out of me.
Rachel, you look poised.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely something in that, and you were right in that nobody could do Berthier's job like Berthier did, in the way that a Grand National winner isn't a unicorn. But I think he still had very, very talented administrators, and Davout was one of them. He couldn't be Berthier because Berthier was irreplaceable. But could you get somebody in who could keep things functioning, maybe not at the exceptional level that Berthier did? I would argue yes. And now the part of that's down to Napoleon, because Napoleon wouldn't have undermined Berthier or sent conflicting orders in the way he does to Soult and Waterloo. So part of that isn't that Soult was crap, it's that he wasn't Berthier, and that, Napoleon and Berthier had a very excellent way of working together. But if we take, hypothetically, Napoleon disappears for a week, who is going to cope without him? And I would argue that's Davout. I think adaptability is exactly the word. Berthier, and I don't want to sound like I'm denigrating him, because I'm really not, because he, for me, I kind of can't compare him to the other marshals. I always keep him in a separate category because he is so integral and he's so essential. But Berthier needs Napoleon's genius to give his meaning, so to speak. All his genius comes from translating Napoleon's. If you took Napoleon out of the equation for whatever reason and Davout had to cope, I think he would. Whereas we see in 1809, when Berthier has to act without Napoleon there, calling the shots in the way that he normally did, we see the knock-on effect of that. Now, that doesn't mean Berthier is any less exceptional at his job, but what I would argue is that means he is the foremost chief of staff of the era, possibly of any era. Davout is the greatest marshal of the era, and that's what I think it's semantics, but that's what I think kind of separates the two. Davout could do everything, maybe not administrate as well as Berthier, but he could do everything. Whereas Berthier has his skill set and he needs Napoleon to give it meaning. If you take Napoleon out of it and ask Berthier to sort of show strategic initiative, that's where I think he's going to start falling down.
And I would counter that to say I'm not sure Davout could show strategic initiative either, since none of them were allowed. Davout basically functioned on operational level at best. Strategic stuff was always Napoleon's bailiwick. It was no one else's. And I would hate to see the greatest marshal, this whole thing, be hinged on a counterfactual. That would seem pretty specious to me. It would.
I mean, that's a fair point. Napoleon didn't like people showing too much initiative. He liked the letter of his orders to be obeyed to the letter. I think that's a totally valid point.
Okay, let's move the conversation on a little bit and think about the opinion of those under their respective commands. Now, again, this is a challenge for Berthier, because this is where the sort of the chalk and cheese element comes in, because who's under Berthier's command? Everybody's under Napoleon's command. Everyone he's communicating with is fundamentally under Napoleon's command. So again, I suppose we start to sort of look at things like relationships with other marshals, which is a challenge for both of these guys. But in terms of managing subordinates, in terms of helping to foster ability and encourage individuals to develop within the roles that they can do, how do these guys stack up? Rachel, shall we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Davout's ability as a commander to inspire confidence is kind of illustrated probably best in his famous three immortals. That's Gudon and Friant and Morat. The fact that he holds on to his senior commanders for as long as he does and works with them as successfully he does, I think is testament, again, to his ability as a commander. Yes, he is not charismatic. He's not personable in that degree that some of the others were, but he's the man they trusted to make the right call, to make the right decisions, and not to squander their lives needlessly. There are contemporary accounts that say, he had an almost like paternal attitude towards the men in the rank under his command. Again, not necessarily demonstrative, but he cared about them in the sense that he wanted to make sure he mitigated any risk that could be avoided, that they were well supplied, that they were well led, that they were well provisioned, that he made the right decisions for them. He was harder on his NCOs, he was even harder on his officers, but he didn't hold anybody to a standard that he did not follow through himself. He was a demanding commander, but you could argue, or I would argue, that his corps is one of the finest corps of the era. They can be trusted to go anywhere. They can be trusted to do anything. They're not going to pillage. They're not going to loot. They're not going to inflame situations with the locals more than necessary because they've been given free rein, like other marshals might do. And the fact that he's not necessarily loved, but he is always respected, even amongst the marshals who don't like him. I mean, even his biggest denigrators, nobody can really turn around and say much about Davout other than he's a cold, awkward git. There's no scandal, there's no mismanagement, there's no incompetence. If the worst we can lay at his feet is that he's not particularly friendly, I think he's doing pretty well. And his subordinates, although, yeah, things kind of break down a bit more on towards the end, his subordinates only have good things to say about him. They trust him. They rely on him. They know he's going to make the right call. And you need to have that relationship, because if you're continuously thinking, is he going to get us killed? Is he making the right decisions? Can he actually adapt? Is he leading us into disaster? You're not going to have the confidence. You're not going to have a corps that can perform as the Third Corps and later First Corps does under Davout.
Ed, I appreciate this is a difficult question for you. Don't worry, we'll get some easier questions in front of you in just a moment. But this is a really hard one to actually judge, because this is where the chalk and cheese thing really comes into its own. So what can we draw on, I guess, to try and understand this and make some point of comparison?
The construct of the army, he gave orders. He gave Napoleon's orders. He's got his own staff. He interacts with other unit staffs, but he does not have a continual relationship as you would if you're commanding a particular unit. He doesn't get that opportunity to foster. In fact, one of the leaders I personally really respect said that leadership is about the mission and developing the subordinates under you. But you can't do that if you really don't have you develop your own. His staff, and he had a complex staff. Why, it's just the stuff I had to try to put together was not easy. But I had my own staff. We worked together. We had things, but I was not tasked with combat, and there's the difference. When you're tasked with combat and death, then you better develop some kind of real trust with your subordinates, and they have to really be able to hear your words and know that your decisions are the best ones that can be made. And I never had that real opportunity. If you hear my divisions that are under me, personnel offices, this is things that need administrative decisions right away. Logistics. again, these are the kind of classes at CGSC that people would go, oh God, logistics, right? But it was super important. And some soldiers love doing the logistics because they know how crucial it is. Intel and recon, again, become specialized things in the Army, but they all just reported to me. I had to go over all the details. Things are coming in, make orders pass. Army quartering and the MPs. Okay, these are all modern jobs, but nothing that there was a reporting and a passing on of orders. So it's difficult. I had no problems with my subordinates. We were all pretty tied in, but if you go into harm's way, you form a bond. And I never had a chance, for the most part, to form that kind of bond, to be able to assess what kind of a leader I would have been given those circumstances. So it's the best I can offer.
No, and what you say is entirely fair. It is the problem with a point of comparison in terms of looking at these guys and their roles. It's not just sort of setting Murat alongside Ney and going, who demonstrates the bigger pair of stones or whatever it might be. Okay, so let's pivot. We talked about sort of high points and great moments. We've also talked about sort of chinks in the armor, but what's the big mistake that they made? If you got to pick one thing one moment where there's an absolute clanger for these guys, what is it and how significant is it in the grander scheme of things? Ed?
Oh, yeah, I've got them. Okay. When I had a chance at command, independent command, because of a mistake, the Austrians surprised us at Wagram. I make a holy mess of it. Okay, I admit it. But after the battle, Napoleon made me the Prince of Wagram, so he couldn't have been too PO'd at me. But yeah, I think that was a mess. And if you really want to know a mess, please be a gentleman and not bring up the rabbit escapade at Tilsit. Please do not bring that up, because that was a disaster. And people don't know what it is. The bunnies that bested the emperor, and I caught holy hell for that because I was supposed to orchestrate that.
And for the uninitiative who aren't aware of the moment when Napoleon has to flee, the over-exuberant rabbits, just enlighten us, Ed, not just purely for educational purposes.
There was just this thing that Napoleon was going to put together for some of the marshals and some friends, and I was supposed to bring up these rabbits. I forgot to feed them, though. Okay, so these were just normal, and so when I released them, they didn't scurry away so that everybody could go like after them. They attacked. Okay, they attacked, and they got.
Can I just point out?
Yes,
the master of logistics here. The guy who can mobilize entire armies over mountain ranges. The guy who can get armies in positions with their supplies, ammunition, food, the whole 9 yards, so that men can fight to the best of their ability in the most hostile of terrains, forgets to feed the bunnies.
The bunnies just showed up. I had no experience with bunnies. I didn't know whether they were fed or not fed. And then they just go nuts, and they're in the carriage. Napoleon's throwing them out the windows, and I knew I was in trouble. Okay. Thanks for bringing it up.
Oh, you are so welcome. You are so welcome. I can't help feeling that Davout would have had a more efficient way of dealing with the over-exuberant bunnies, Rachel.
He couldn't have been any...
I can't imagine Davout being particularly fond of bunnies. He wasn't a very cuddly man. I mean, can we just give Berthier credit for taking the blame when Napoleon shot Massena in the face and then blamed Berthier, who could have gone, no, it bloody wasn't, it was you, who of course went, of course, sire, it was me. Yes, yeah, sorry, Massena, it was me. I mean, let's give him some additional credit. He unleashed all the bunnies, but he covers up for Napoleon's bad aim.
Perhaps he was playing the long game. Perhaps the bunnies were the revenge.
Bad days. Bad days.
Okay, Rachel, Davout's big mistake.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if we can call it a big mistake in the. Oh no, actually, I'm going to change my mind because I was going to talk about Russia, and the fact that he's replaced by Ney as rear guard when Napoleon thinks he's moving too slow, and he does actually wait too long for Ney at Krasny, but he's sort of blamed when Ney's men are believed to be lost. Everybody kind of turns on Davout. I would argue unjustifiably because there was very little else he could have done, but it does mark a point where Davout's gone from being this sort of figure on a pedestal to it was his fault. But again, I'm torn between that and Hamburg. Again, in both these cases, militarily speaking, he's making the right call, but they're not popular decisions. I think I'll go with Hamburg, actually, never mind Russia. The expulsion of several thousand, in fact, I think it's as much as 25,000 civilians out of Hamburg into winter terrain with very little notice. He could have given them more notice, and I think even his biggest defenders would have said that. It is at very, very short notice in very, very harsh conditions. And yes, you're a military man doing a military job, but have some humanity equally.
Yeah, because this is the thing. It's far from unprecedented. There's huge precedent both in the history of the Napoleonic era on both sides, but equally there's huge precedent for this across military history writ large. It's a very logical thing to do when you're trying to preserve resources for the troops that need to defend the city. But is that a problem with Davout? Are there other instances where you kind of look at him and go, yeah, but remembering the human element is sort of your failure here? Do we see the same kinds of problems or the same flaws of judgment cropping up in other places? Is this basically a trend, is what I'm asking?
No, I wouldn't say that. I would argue that you made the comparison to Wellington earlier, and I do feel he's the sort of French Wellington in that for both of them, yes, there's similarity of personality and stuff, but in both of them, you would say that they never spend life cheaply. And some of the more daring marshals, and admittedly, you need these complex varieties of personality for the whole thing to work. If you have 1,000 Berthiers, you're going to have excellent administration, but maybe not the victories. If you have 1,000 Davouts, you're not going to inspire the same. So you need the Neys and you need the Murats occasionally, and you need the Lan. But he never spends life cheaply. I really don't think that's something you could lay at his door, that he doesn't value the human element of it. But that same loyalty and that same sort of adherence to Napoleon's wishes, which is what makes him hold Hamburg for as long as he does. Again, if we're totally being pro Bonaparte as French perspective, he's making the right call. He ties down a huge amount of troops that could have been causing problems elsewhere if Davout doesn't hold Hamburg. But if we're going to purely take a step back and look at it from the human cost, it's very hard to justify that at all. And I know, you know far better than any of us, like siege warfare is ugly warfare, and there's no such thing, I think, as a ethical siege. But it is very hard. I am Chief Davout fangirl number 100%, but there's very little you can say in that defense that's a very, very horrible episode in his career.
Yeah, there's a reason that Clausewitz calls sieges generally an unavoidable evil. And there is, I think we can sort of leave that conversation there. To wrap this up, I want to talk about legacy. Now, I promised Ed that I would feed him some easier sticks to chew on over the course of this debate. I think it's not going to surprise anybody to hear me say that this is an easier fight for Berthier than it is for Davout. But let's just dwell on the legacies of these guys and their positions in French national memory, which is perhaps a slightly different curveball. Having been to Père Lachaise only very recently for the first time, I did feel sorry for Davout in the sense that he is squished up behind some of the others, and you miss him so easily. You don't miss Murat's. Murat's grave is understated, which is not a phrase that you expect to utter. But compare it to Ney's, for example, or some of the others. Suchet's grave, very modest. But Davout's you just can miss entirely, and you can't sort of stand there and reflect. And I find that quite curious, and I wonder to what extent those kinds of elements are also visible in the wider French perception of Davout. Sure, great moment at Auerstadt, but that dependability means that, and that competency means that he gets less limelight and less attention than Berthier, who is so symbiotic with Napoleon, and inevitably loses out to the flashy Neys and Murat's and all the rest of them. So in terms of both the legacy and position in French national memory, let's get your thoughts. Ed, I'm going to start with you.
That's an interesting slant to it. I'm going to actually speak as me rather than Berthier. He's in the loo. Okay,
he's having a lie down.
Yes,
he's recovering from the bunny episode. Let's be real.
The bunny episode brought back palpitations. Like I mentioned before, we had French officers as part of CGSE, and they were surprised that we even studied Napoleon because they don't. In their senior military academies, they do not study Napoleon. Our guys studied Berthier, but I will tell you, as you know, my graduate degrees at Ohio State, Davout was the guy. I am a huge Davout fan, so to be here, but as an academic, his independence of command, drew the historians. Now, did the I will call the new historians, they're drawn to Marat, they're drawn to all the flash and all that, and then you go, you'll learn, just keep reading, and I kept telling him, keep reading till you get to Berthier, because you'll understand this whole thing about who's behind everything, who's behind all the decisions. It's not sexy. Logistics, order writing, being a coach with Napoleon endlessly is not a good time. So to see how the French have minimized Napoleon, let alone his key marshals, is like, again, I was shocked when the French these officers were just really happy that they were getting an education on Napoleon in America, in D.C. So it was sad in retrospect that we didn't have time to get them into the Marshals much, a little bit, but not much. And I was pushing Davout, but they only have so much time to read and so much time, because I get them from the bottom up. I give them readings and I let them form the questions. So it's not me telling them what to learn. I let them discover things, and they're pretty much taken with I let them have the epiphanies. They're taken with the connections between the modern staff and how it works, and the things that Berthier and Napoleon put in place to make it work. They're really shocked that that's in place. They're also shocked at Davout's independence of command, given that era.
Rachel, let me get your thoughts on both legacy and position in French national memory for Davout.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to argue with anything Ed just said. And I mean, I guess I come at it from a slightly different perspective in that I'm not a historian, I'm not an expert, I'm not technically in any way qualified to talk about any of this. I'm just a hobbyist with a hyperfixation. But you can't stand here and argue that Berthier's fingerprints aren't all over the waging of war from that point on. Of course you can. He changes everything. Again, he builds a system, and the world adapted to Berthier's system. So his impact's astronomical. I mean, I think it would be very hard to overstate how much impact he has. That's a different kind of story for Davout. And yeah, we've said it already. Charisma talks. It matters, and you can see it in that. yeah, I'm famously very critical of Murat, and I do think it's amazing how much he gets away with. You know, Marmont is boo, hiss, get the pitchfork, but Murat, who turns before Marmont does, he's glam, he's sexy, you know, he charges the Cossacks, woo Murat. But, and I'm being sarcastic, but there's elements of that in it, and he gets away with it because he is flashy, he's daring, he's got the panache, he's got the charisma. And we will overlook Ney's sort of inconsistency of command because undeniably Ney is one of the most charismatic, personally brave individuals in the French army. So that talks louder than quiet competence, I think. But if we look at it from, you know, other points of view, the impact of his kind of last actions, realistically, would there have even been an army to fight Waterloo if we didn't have Davout's Minister of War? Potentially not. It's Davout who crucially negotiates that armistice that the Allies, technically speaking, don't really, well, the Bourbons don't honour because they go and shoot Ney, amongst various others. But his legacy, I would argue, is that even when all of the Napoleonic system's crumbling around him, the second abdication's gone, he is to be the one who goes to Napoleon and says, you know, sire, it's over. He prioritises France, even as the most fervently Bonapartist of most of the marshals. He prioritises France. He goes to Napoleon and says, look, it is over. They want you to go. He does that. And then I know I've brought it up on multiple occasions, but I do think in an era of very grand gestures, I do think this is really impressive that he knows he's basically putting his back against the wall when he goes to argue for Ney. And again, this isn't Oudinot, this isn't Desailly, this isn't Goudon, this isn't his closest friends. He's got professional respect for Ney. They were slightly frostier after Russia, but this is not somebody that it's really in his personal interest to save. But he goes because it's the right thing to do. And he goes and he argues for Ney and destroying his own fortunes in the process because he's left with virtually nothing. He and his wife are living in comparative poverty. He loses his titles, he loses his position. So it's not just the impact on him, but the impact of his family. But he still does it because it's the right thing to do. And I think that legacy of doing what's right, even when and I know this sounds twee, but doing what's right, even when it's difficult, of making the call you feel is the right thing to do, of being able to make moral decisions, of being able to prioritise not just your commander, but what is good for your country, I think does have an impact. And I think it is a shining example of how not to just be a great man, but I would argue a good one. Not necessarily a charismatic or a friendly one, I make that distinction again, but still a good man. And yeah, I think, admittedly, in our sort of community that we all kind of have on Twitter and podcasts, there is a lot of admiration for Davout because there's a lot of sensible people going, yes, Ney and Murat are good, but you need a steady hand at the tiller when you've got everybody else off charging things. And Davout is that. So is it as long-standing a legacy as Berthier's? No. Does he fundamentally change the waging of war like Berthier does? No. But I still think it's not a legacy to be ashamed of.
And there, folks, we have the case for both Berthier and Davout. Who was Napoleon's greatest marshal? You decide. Vote below or head to social media where you can also make your voices heard, and we will count up all the totals and crown the final champion. A huge thank you once again to Ed Koss, Emeritus Professor at the United States Command and General Staff College, and Rachel Stark, our absolutely fantastic champion of the Marshals in our Marshals series. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Merry Christmas, folks, and we will be back very soon. This Christmas, support the show for free by subscribing so that you never miss an episode. And if you've got a question, post it in the comments section and we'll get back to you. Don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, and Napoleonic nerd catch-ups on Patreon. The link is in the description. Shoutouts to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-December 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice DeGraff, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillam, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, Wojciech Stefanovic, Simon Weathers, John, Zach Johnson, Matthew Turner, Rich Payne, Edward Gilhead, Vic Martindale, and Adam Coslin. The Admirals, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Wilcombe, Clemens Beman, Steve Carter, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, Darla Vincent, Rob Painter, Simon T, Alex, JC Kaiser, and Graham Swidenbank. And in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell, Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell, Chosen Man Graham, the Yankee Eurogale Jarl Brian Silicate, First Lord of the Treasury Ryan Diamond, Portree Prince of Pukalani Bob Burnham, General Alexander Suvorov, Seth Hansen, and too Jacobin to crown himself, Dan Hazelwood. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, stay nerdy, and as always, thank you for listening.